All right, we are at part 5 of our series, and this is, are you EQing for tonality or are you EQing for transients? This had me mixed up for so long because it wasn't even on my radar. So let's hop into DAW and let's learn this distinction.
Are we shaping notes or are we shaping impact? There's a difference between sculpting a melodic instrument and sculpting a transient one. When you EQ a melodic instrument like a bass, a piano, a vocal, you're actually shaping notes. Cutting certain frequencies is actually cutting notes, or if you're boosting certain notes. But when you're EQing something transient like a snare drum, a kick drum, a hi-hat, something that doesn't have a super defined note, you're shaping the impact. So you can think of it as melodic EQ changes what you hear, while transient EQ changes what you feel and how you feel it. And when you get that balance right, the mix just explodes. So if I pull up, for example, this bass guitar, pop a Q3 on, we are just going to look at this bass width. If you watch the note down here, or the energy in this area that I'm moving my cursor, you're going to notice as the bass player switches from chord to chord, the general area of density changes. So watch that kind of skip around. So you can see it jump. Now, it's easy to get into trouble with that if we are thinking about just the concept of I need my bass to have more bass. I am not Stradivarius. I do not build instruments, but different types of instruments have different resonant pockets in them, like necks of guitars can create different resonant pockets for certain notes. Drums, the type of wood that are used on certain things might create more of a ringing in a particular frequency area. So we have things that are kind of baked in inherent to the instrument or the player that we have to deal with. But yet, if we are just looking at this from the concept of, oh, I'm listening to my mix and my bass sounds thin, or my bass just sounds a little too woolly in a certain spot, and I grab an EQ and just start kind of cutting and saying, oh yeah, I definitely want a little bit more of that like 40 hertz area, and oh, I definitely want like a little bit more of like the 153, and you know, this 70 area, I'm gonna notch it because, hey man, I was told you gotta, you know, watch frequency masking and I got to make room for my kick drum. Well, watch what happens. Listen to the bass guitar when I do this. You hear how it almost sounds phasey now? Like that main note, which was the pumping energy driver of the whole song, now feels like it totally vanishes. Just watch when I bring this 70 hertz in and out. So you can see how if we're not doing things with intention and we're not recognizing whether we are EQing tonally or whether we are EQing for transient punch, we can get ourselves into trouble where now I can almost dissemble this bass progression and have it start to feel unnatural to the way the bass player played it, where now certain notes are sticking out more than others. But yet also the inverse is true. We can use this to rein in particular notes if needed, to kind of balance notes out. If we felt like one note was under-sustaining, we could kind of find that particular frequency and boost it up to create a little bit more of a level line, especially if we were going into a compressor. Now, I'm not like much of a gearhead as far as like really being obsessed with plugins, but one plugin that's kind of cool for that, if you're definitely worried about it and you're like, oh no, you know, EJ, I don't know, now I'm afraid I'm going to mess everything up and I don't know what to do. Everybody panics! Oh my God! Well, you could look into a plugin like Surfer EQ. I think this is like one of the like super like entry ones that was either free through something else I had or whatever. What the Surfer EQ does is it recognizes that we are dealing with tonal EQ, and watch this little bump here follow the bass notes around. That's pretty cool, right? So that's a great trick and it's a great tool. So I love plugins that can save me time, because the alternative to this would be to put, for example, a Q3 up to go through and kind of get a sense of which bass note might be popping out too much or not, and then kind of use some EQ to kind of boost and level that, and then maybe put it through a compressor to kind of like cement it in and stabilize it. But plugins like this can kind of surf those notes and give you that low end bump consistently throughout about the progression. So if you listen to songs like, say, like Adele's, Someone Like You, or really Delicate, you have to be very broad and gentle with your EQ. Shelves, plugins like this that might move with the notes to help keep things feeling natural and together. When we start breaking out the Q3s and we start carving, as you saw when we dipped the 70 hertz, which was like, oh, maybe we're doing that to make room for the kick drum. Well, that note now started to vanish on the bass. It started to make the performance uneven. And if you're dealing with a delicate performance, something that's supposed to feel very, natural, you might start to unknowingly start sucking that emotion out of your mix. So definitely asking yourself, am I EQing for tonality and stability through that chord progression, or am I EQing for transients? So let's look at something like a snare sample for a second. So these two areas that I just boosted, if you saw the other videos, you know that we're kind of looking at this in terms of, is it a volume thing or a frequency thing? So down in this area with my snare drum, I'm going to have kind of the concussion of the stick hitting the drum and the ringing of the shell. So we're getting the body. And again, this might be the question we're going to ask ourselves is, are we dealing with just too much body based off the drum, the stick, the way the drummer is playing, or is it some proximity effect? Because again, when we listen to snare drums, right, we don't listen to it with our ear an inch off or 3 finger lengths off the surface of the snare drum. So we might get extra buildup in this area that is unnatural to the sound of the snare drum. But yet, if we thin it out too much, 100% the drummer is going to come back and say, why does my snare drum sound so thin? This area up here, this 4K on up to the 8K area, is really where we're going to get a lot of our stick slap. That's where we're going to hear the definition. So if you get drummers that are doing, some buzz strokes or some nuanced things on the snare drum, or if you just need to feel like you're hearing that stick kind of dig into the head a little bit, if the drummer says, I need more snap in my snare drum, this is an area that we want to go for. So if we ask ourselves, again, one of the main themes through this series, is it a fader thing or is it an EQ thing? If the drummer says, turn my snare drum up, and I just go to the fader and push the fader up, well, I'm bringing up the body, I am bringing up the articulation. And maybe now if I am pushing that body up because the snare drum needs to be louder, now this whole balance that I had in my mix could be unraveling, because now this could be all of a sudden fighting the acoustic guitar. It could be fighting part of the bass. It could be fighting the low end of the keys. And then the keyboard player says, oh, hey, where'd my keyboards go? And then we get what's called fader creep. Do the creep. Fader creep is where we make one adjustment, and then the next thing you know, you're going down the line and you're kind of pushing up faders, and then you go from having faders that are generally around 0 to now all of a sudden feeling like you're running out of headroom. And that's an easy way, because we're not asking ourselves, is this a fader thing or an EQ thing? So if a drummer says, hey, turn my snare drum up, you can ask, are you looking for more body? Do you feel the drum is lacking more body? Are you feeling like you're not hearing enough of the definition? And they might say, oh yeah, I just don't feel like I'm hearing the crack of the drum enough. Well, then we can go for an EQ and we can work on just boosting that crack. And then we can ask ourselves, because we're seasoned mix pros, we've watched this whole series so far, right?
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
What is this now going to impact? If I am boosting these frequencies, then that means I am boosting these frequencies into the range of where other instruments were speaking in this mix up to this point. So if I am boosting the crack of the snare drum, who is going to be stepping back a little bit to make room for that crack? And asking yourself, can I still free up that space by panning something to the right or to the left, getting things out of the way? If it's a guitar, asking yourself, is there now another area of the guitar that I can use to kind of speak? Or, can I separate them enough so that the guitar, I can still have those frequencies working, and yet there's enough room for both the crack of the snare and the top end of the guitar to exist? But back to the concept of, with a snare drum, we're tonally shaping. I can roll off the bottom of the snare, because as you're watching, right, what we're noticing is this note is not changing. So it's easier for us to hone in. Say we want to do like an API thing, right? A big boost that the cue gets tighter as we go, because the drummer wants, some sort of indie-ish sounding, ringy snare drum, and which that's all going to be in this area. I find sometimes anywhere between a 5 and 700, you can squeeze out a little bit of extra shell. So just say for hypothetical reasons, the drummer didn't want it to sound like a Motley Crue snare drum with all this top end shimmer and crack and everything else, and want it to feel kind of dirty and thuddy. This would be the area that we'd be looking at. And we are shaping the transient. Listen to how it bypassed. The drum will get punchier when we engage the EQ. Of course, the tonality will change a little bit, but watch the punch. So that's using EQ to shape your transients. So when we're thinking about references, again, you could think of like Adele's Someone Like You for tonal shaping, and Nirvana's Smell Like Teen Spirit, or anything really off that record, Nevermind, which is just, kind of EQ'd for like maximum transient impact. One of the things when I do record bands, especially with guitar players, I'll ask them when they're setting their distortion pedals, are you looking for more note in your distortion pedal, or are you looking for more kind of just gain and drive? Because you could have heavy distortion, but still hear clean note articulation and clean chugging, or you can have that kind of distortion that just basically sounds like white noise washing over everything. And it's important knowing that at the tracking phase, or even when you're listening, if you didn't have the ability to track, but you're being given stems, asking yourself, okay, well, where is the instrument speaking? And am I hearing the chord articulation? Or is this an instrument that's being used for texture or some sort of transient impact? And EQing accordingly. So again, I hope that you appreciate and notice the differences between EQing for tonality and EQing for transients, and making sure that you don't get wrapped up in blindly looking to unmask things, because especially if you're doing that to acoustics, guitars, pianos, basses, you could be cutting notes and creating almost like a weird phasey kind of sound, and having the chord progression start to lose emotional impact. And when you're dealing with your drums or any sort of information where you're looking for transients, understanding that, the transient information should be more stable. You can kind of hone in on it and then look to kind of cement the area that you want the transient punch to come from. And then if you do want to cement that in with functional compression or something like that, you'll have a much more focused sound to do so.
Okay, my friends, so I hope you had just as much fun watching this series as I had making it. One of the greatest gifts that I've learned from just kind of hopping on YouTube and trying to find people that I can talk about this wonderful craft with and share ideas with is just how much these videos help sharpen the way that I think about mixing, and really to identify what are the core things that I find to be my philosophy. Essentially tapping into what is like my mixing subconscious and asking myself and drawing these things to the forefront and finding out what really matters to me and how I can best communicate and articulate that to you out there. So never be shy about dropping me any comments, letting me know things that you would like me to discuss. I am so appreciative of all the support and all the encouragement. Till the next videos, have fun mixing, my friends. Take care.